Good afternoon, folks. I happened across the now infamous video discussion between Richard Spencer, Sargon and Styx H the other day, and was a little surprised to note how absolutely pitiful Spencer's arguments were, especially in contrast with how many in the comments section thought he made sense, apparently. I had to address some of these as follows. At the open, Spencer tries to make the point that John Locke's or Jefferson's ideas and presumably James Madison's or Thomas Paine's or Alexander Hamilton's ideas are irrelevant because they don't comport with something he calls lived experience. Then, not 2 minutes later, as soon as Styx asks him how his ideas would be implemented, he says, "The ethno-state, as he defined it, currently is an ideal that does not exist." Now that's head-snapping incoherence. Everybody knows the difference between a set of ideas on paper and a real society. The question, that's just not the question. The question is which set of those ideas, when applied, creates the best society? Now the next major issue discussed is the question of what exactly a white person is, and how do you identify white people? If that's how you're defining a nation, you want to be able to define what a white person is. Now, I deal with this question in my free book, available at thesaneparty.com, because there's a great deal of controversy on this coming from all sides. The point I make is one of governmental pragmatism. Now, Spencer essentially says that we all know what we're talking about when we talk about race, and that we know it when we see it. Insofar as that is the case, we're not talking as much about biological background as we are a set of visual stereotypes. It's not as much that race is a cultural construct as it is that the vast majorities of people are mixed race, and whatever outward expression of that mix happens to fit a particular stereotype is how people are judged in terms of race and society in lived experience. The fact is that two people whose appearance fits a certain stereotype can have a natural child that fits a different stereotype, etc. Ultimately, Spencer is arguing here not in favor of a genetically homogeneous state, as he is one in which people don't look like black people. If they can pass for white, they're in, essentially, according to Spencer's view of the overall idea that he's trying to put forward. He was getting nailed for this pretty well by both Styx and Sargon, but his best comeback was when he said that white people are anyone who cannot get affirmative action, essentially. But that's an interesting interpretation. He really just aligns himself with the philosophy held by other flavors of leftists, which ultimately just supports the libertarian view that affirmative action should not exist, and that meritocracy rather than racial preference is the better goal. Spencer then tries to head off a different argument that various subsets of white people had been warring between one another in Europe forever, by saying that America had shown leadership in illustrating that all of these disparate white groups could live successfully with one another in America, glossing right over the method by which America was able to accomplish that, which was to unite these people on ideological rather than ethnic commonalities. If a nation is able to unite sets of disparate people who generally share a skin color, what's to say that others who agree with libertarian principles can't also successfully participate in that society with other skin colors? Spencer again destroyed his own argument here. Then we get to the most disturbing revelation in the first part of this epic discussion that I watched. The fact that Spencer doesn't know what rights are. He literally says, why does an individual have some sort of claim to not being controlled by a collective? I'm surprised by how few people really get this. And I deal with this specific question in my book, How to Save the World in Under 50 Pages, in a chapter called What Are Rights and Where Do They Come From? A right is not given to you by a collective that rules over you, as Spencer seems to believe. A right refers to what an individual is justified in defending. Now, those on the right will often say that rights are God-given, but this is misleading, and in fact, in ways, the opposite of that is the correct answer, because our rights originate not from what we know about God, but from what we don't know about God. It is the self-evident fact that no other human being has a more direct relationship with God than any other individual that makes a single individual justified in defending his liberty from all encroachments by other human beings. Further, our rights as individuals are exactly the same if we are the only human being in the universe or one among billions on the same planet. As I point out in the book, it is the fact of your existence that justifies your actions to continue your existence. If you are standing under a tall tree and a giant branch snaps off and plummets toward you, are you justified in stepping aside? Or must you allow nature to destroy you? Or, on the other hand, if you spend all summer gathering food for the winter and some other human being who gathered nothing decides to just kill you and take what you've gathered, do you have a right to defend yourself from that act? Leftists will often say that healthcare or education should be a right because they agree with Spencer that rights emanate from the barrel of a gun. But no one can claim a right to have someone else do something for him, as that is just the definition of slavery. Now, Sargon probably could have countered these arguments more successfully if he weren't peeing himself with girlish giggling from incredulity at Spencer's horrible arguments. There is one thing that Spencer said that I agree with partially, however, and it is the following. He said there will be competing visions of who will rule the planet, and those who have a passion and a will to enact a bold vision are going to be the winners in that struggle, and the rest will be slaves. Now, I agree that there are competing visions, and those who have passion and will to enact those visions will triumph, at least in the short term. But his argument implies that one of these visions is as good as another as long as you're on the winning side of it, because you will be enslaved if yours doesn't win. Now, I would argue that one vision is better, because nobody has to be a slave in the America defined in the Constitution. You only have to respect the rights and boundaries of other people. But there is a vision of a society built by Locke and Madison and Paine and Hamilton and others where there are limitations on the force of government against every citizen. And that is, as Styx points out, the United States of America. As I detail on my site, the Constitution has not been understood and therefore has not been followed, which means the society we see today is only partially influenced by its logic. But still, no one can argue that it isn't the best society in the history of the planet, even with its Marxist wounds. It will take bold vision and force to right the ship, but not to force those with resources to give them to those without, but to force those who take stolen goods from the welfare state to instead take responsibility for their own lives and to accept the lots they draw for themselves with good humor or get out of the country. The question is how to use force in the way that respects the natural rights of citizens, balanced against what natural human beings have, which is a desire for humane treatment of those who can't fend for themselves. Now that's a topic that no one has yet addressed clearly, and it's going to take a dedicated video in the near future to address it precisely. So look for that, it's coming up. However, the point I'm making here is that Richard Spencer's arguments are just one logical fallacy after another. His style of oratory reminds me of Hillary Clinton, and that's not a compliment. It's just a different set of platitudes coming out of a different pie hole. Measured against the softest standard of coherence or consistency, he rates a solid meh. I think Richard Spencer's picture should be beside the word sophist in the dictionary. For someone who is so enamored with the fact that the white race has a significantly larger segment of those with high IQ than some other races, it doesn't seem to me that he or his proponents belong to that segment. Sargon, bless his little heart, bless his little enlarged heart, couldn't argue through his own hyperventilation on that particular session. But if these are the arguments that Spencer is going to rely on to establish his credibility, then he doesn't have any business calling anyone else dumb. I may get around to watching more of that debate, but I can only take so much punishment from people who don't know what reason is. It's like pulling a string on a talking doll and getting random phrases back that you've heard a million times before. That just doesn't really cut it, Mr. Spencer. The United States that is described in the Constitution is the better of these societies. And you don't have to be a slave, but you do have to have will, and you do have have to understand it, and you do have to exert force to achieve it. And that's what I'm going to be fighting for. Thanks for watching.